The Bohemian crystal glass slipped from Charlotte's trembling fingers at the exact moment Robert Vanderbilt leaned over to reach for the salt shaker. The Bordeaux red wine spread across the gentleman's brocade silk waistcoat like an open wound, staining the ivory-colored fabric an intense crimson. The dining hall fell silent, 16 pairs of eyes fixed on Charlotte, whose face had taken on the exact shade of the roses that adorned the center of the table. The young governess remained paralyzed, watching the stain expand inexorably across the expensive garment, acutely aware that her only decent dress, a modest grey muslin gown borrowed from Mrs. Pemberton, could never compensate for the damage caused. Mr. Vanderbilt, forgive me. I beg of you." The words spilled out in a disjointed torrent as Charlotte abruptly stood up, knocking over her own chair in the process. The mahogany chair hit the marble floor with a crash that echoed through the mansion like a hammer blow. "It was absolutely unforgivable of me. I will pay for the garment, though it may take me years." The family matriarch, Mrs. Vanderbilt, compressed her lips into a thin line of disapproval. Her jewels, emeralds rumored to have belonged to Austrian royalty, caught the light from the chandeliers, casting greenish reflections over her severe countenance. To her right, her youngest daughter, Penelope, barely suppressed a malicious smile. The other guests, all members of New York high society, awaited the inevitable outburst of fury. Robert remained motionless for an instant that seemed to last an eternity. Charlotte watched him slowly rise, the wine stain now trickling down his nankeen trousers. He had the imposing height of the Vanderbilts, broad shoulders beneath his perfectly tailored coat, precisely parted brown hair. At 28, he was considered New York's most coveted bachelor, heir to a fortune built on railroads and real estate speculation. Charlotte braced herself for the reprimand, for the public humiliation that would surely follow. Her position as a newly hired governess for the Ashworth family depended on this evening. Mrs. Pemberton, owner of the placement agency that had brought her from England 6 months prior, had arranged this dinner specifically so Charlotte could learn American social graces before departing for the countryside, where she would oversee the education of 3 children. A disaster like this could ruin not only her prospects, but also the agency's reputation. The silence became oppressive. Then, to the absolute astonishment of all present, Robert began to laugh. It was not a restrained or courteous laugh. It was a genuine, deep peal of laughter that shook his shoulders and illuminated his usually serious features. He picked up the Irish linen napkin and began to dab at his waistcoat with nonchalant movements, as if wine stains were everyday occurrences at formal Vanderbilt dinners. "My dear Miss—" He paused, arching an inquisitive eyebrow. "Fairfax. Charlotte Fairfax, sir." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Miss Fairfax." Robert took a few steps towards her, approaching so closely that Charlotte had to lift her chin to meet his eyes. They were dark brown, almost black, with tiny golden flecks that caught the candlelight. "For the past 2 years I have attended these interminable dinners, surrounded by people who weigh every word, every gesture, every breath, all performing this elaborate dance of polite falsehoods." He gestured broadly at the gaping guests. "And then you, with your accidental honesty, managed to do in 1 second what no one here would dare in a lifetime." "Robert!" Mrs. Vanderbilt practically hissed his name. "Contain yourself. And Miss Fairfax has shown an unforgivable lack of coordination. She has shown herself to be human, Mother, a concept apparently foreign in this house." Before Charlotte could process what was happening, Robert leaned in and kissed her. It was not a chaste kiss on the hand as conventions would dictate. It was a firm kiss on the lips before 16 scandalized witnesses in the middle of the grand Vanderbilt dining hall, beneath the immense crystal chandelier imported from Venice. Charlotte felt the world spin. The scent of men's cologne, something woody with notes of sandalwood, mixed with the aroma of spilled wine. The rough texture of the stained waistcoat brushing against her dress, the warmth of his hands gently holding her waist, firm enough to prevent her from retreating. When he finally pulled away, there was a defiant glint in his eyes. "Finally, someone real in this house of porcelain," he declared, loud enough for every person present to hear clearly. Chaos immediately ensued. Mrs. Vanderbilt stood up with such force that her chair almost toppled, saved only by the butler's quick reflexes. Penelope let out a sharp cry. The guests erupted in indignant murmurs, some gentlemen even rising halfway, uncertain whether they should defend the young lady's honor or the host's dignity. Charlotte remained frozen, unable to form coherent thoughts. Her first kiss, if that brief experience at 15 with the vicar's son in Hampshire even counted, certainly hadn't been like this. It hadn't been public, scandalous, completely inappropriate, and absolutely breathtaking. "Have you completely lost your mind?" Mrs. Vanderbilt's voice cut through the commotion like a blade. This person is a servant, a governess, and you compromise her publicly in this manner." "Compromise?" Robert smiled, but there was something dangerous in his expression. "What an interesting word, Mother. Yes, I suppose I do." Charlotte finally found her voice. "Mr. Vanderbilt, please, you needn't. I must go. Immediately." She turned to Mrs. Pemberton, who watched the scene with an expression somewhere between horror and calculated fascination. "Madam, I offer my sincerest apologies. I understand this concludes my placement with the Ashworth family." "Absolutely not." Robert intercepted her before she could take 2 steps. "Miss Fairfax, the damage to my attire is insignificant. I own dozens of waistcoats. But your honesty, your genuine reaction." He lowered his voice, though everyone in the now silent room could still hear. "It is something rare, precious even. I will not allow you to be punished for it. Robert Cornelius Vanderbilt." His full name echoed through the room like a judicial decree. "Are you intoxicated?" "Perfectly sober, Mother. Perhaps for the first time in years." He did not take his eyes off Charlotte. "Miss Fairfax will travel to her position as planned, but before that I formally request permission to court her." The hall erupted in exclamations. Charlotte felt her legs weaken. Court her? A Vanderbilt wished to court her. The situation had surpassed absurdity and entered the territory of complete fantasy. "This is outrageous!" One of the guests, a corpulent gentleman, Charlotte had been informed, was an important banker, slapped his palm on the table. "The difference in social standing—" "It is irrelevant to me," Robert interrupted, still not taking his gaze from Charlotte. "So, Miss Fairfax, do you grant me the honor?" Charlotte knew she should refuse. Every fiber of her upbringing, every lesson on appropriate behavior, demanded that she politely decline, apologize again, and disappear into the obscurity befitting her station. A governess did not accept courtship from a Vanderbilt heir. It simply did not happen. But when she looked into those brown eyes, she saw something that disarmed her completely. It was not condescension or cruel amusement. It was hope, genuine, vulnerable hope. Her voice faltered. Charlotte took a deep breath, aware that her next word would change everything. "Yes." The Vanderbilt carriage traversed the gas-lit streets of New York, with the characteristic smoothness of custom-made vehicles. Charlotte remained stiff against the burgundy velvet seat, unable to fully process the events of the last hour. Mrs. Pemberton, seated opposite her, alternated between expressions of shock and something dangerously akin to commercial triumph. "This is absolutely unprecedented," the lady murmured for the 5th time since they had left the mansion. "In 30 years of running the agency, never, simply never." She fanned herself vigorously with her fan, though the April evening temperature was quite mild. Charlotte remained silent, watching the lights of the residences pass by the window. Her hands, gloved in plain white cotton, trembled slightly in her lap. The kiss still burned on her lips like an indelible mark. She could feel the weight of the scandalized stares, hear the whispers that were surely already spreading through New York's drawing rooms like fire through dry straw. "What have I done?" she finally managed to articulate, her voice sounding strangely distant to her own ears. Mrs. Pemberton interrupted her frantic fanning. "What have you done, my dear? You may very well have secured the future of any young woman I represent. A Vanderbilt, if this courtship prospers." Her eyes gleamed with mercenary possibilities. "But we must proceed with extreme caution." Mrs. Vanderbilt was absolutely livid. "That woman possesses considerable influence." "I shouldn't have accepted," Charlotte whispered, more to herself than to her companion. "It was reckless. It was." It was the only possible answer, Mrs. Pemberton interrupted with a firm voice. To refuse publicly would have been an even greater offence. You did the right thing, albeit for reasons you likely do not fully comprehend. The carriage slowed before a modest boarding house in a respectable, but decidedly not elegant area of Manhattan. Mrs. Pemberton maintained rooms there for her pupils while they awaited placement. Charlotte had spent the last 3 weeks at that establishment, preparing for her journey to the countryside. "Rest tonight," the lady instructed as the coachman opened the door. "Tomorrow morning, we will discuss the next steps. The Ashworth family awaits your arrival within 4 days, but I suspect that, well, circumstances have changed considerably." Charlotte descended from the carriage with legs that felt like jelly. The proprietor of the boarding house, Mrs. Holloway, a middle-aged widow with a penchant for gossip, intercepted her immediately in the narrow vestibule. "Miss Fairfax, how was dinner at the Vanderbilt mansion? It must have been absolutely dazzling." It was. Memorable. Charlotte managed a weak smile before retreating upstairs, ignoring the additional questions the lady lobbed in her direction. Her room was small but clean, furnished with a narrow bed, a pine dresser, and a porcelain washing basin. Charlotte lit the oil lamp with trembling hands, then sat heavily on the edge of the bed. The grey muslin dress, which that morning had seemed adequate, though simple, now felt like a witness to her humiliation and subsequent impossible elevation. She raised her fingers to her lips, touching them softly. Robert Vanderbilt had kissed her, in front of his mother, in front of New York society, and then declared his intention to court her. "This cannot be real," she murmured to the empty room. But it was real. As real as the wine stain that would probably never entirely leave his waistcoat, as real as the look of murderous fury in Mrs. Vanderbilt's eyes, as real as the vulnerable hope Charlotte had seen on Robert's face. She lay down without removing her dress, staring at the damp-stained ceiling. Her mind spun in frantic circles, replaying every moment, every word. Why had he done that? A man of his standing could have any woman. Wealthy heiresses, acknowledged beauties, young ladies with impeccable pedigrees. Why choose an English governess with no fortune, no connections, nothing but a decent education and an unfortunate tendency for accidents with wine glasses? Finally, someone real in this house of porcelain. The words echoed in her mind. There was something in the way he had pronounced them, not cruel or disdainful, but exhausted, as if he had spent years searching for something he couldn't name until that moment. Charlotte turned onto her side, hugging the thin pillow. She thought of her mother, deceased 3 years prior from typhoid fever. She thought of her father, a rural clergyman who had died 6 months later, leaving her without family and without resources. She thought of the journey from Hampshire to London, then the terrifying Atlantic crossing in 3rd class, the desperate weeks spent seeking a position until she found Mrs. Pemberton's agency. She had built a modest but honest life. It wasn't much, but it was hers. And now, with a single impulsive kiss, everything was at risk. Sleep eventually found her, but it was populated by turbulent dreams of ballrooms where everyone wore porcelain masks that shattered at the slightest touch, revealing empty faces behind them. Morning arrived too soon, announced by the nearby church bell striking 6 o'clock. Charlotte quickly washed with cold water from the basin, put on her other dress, a discreet brown one, and pinned her hair into a severe bun. The woman staring back at her from the small, cracked mirror looked pale and frightened. Nothing in her appearance suggested someone who could capture the attention of a Vanderbilt. Mrs. Holloway served oatmeal porridge in the common dining room, her eyes gleaming with ill-disguised curiosity. 2 other boarders, an elderly governess and a young music teacher, cast speculative glances in Charlotte's direction. News travelled quickly, even without telephones or telegraphs. Charlotte had barely touched her coffee when urgent knocks sounded at the front door. Moments later, Mrs. Holloway appeared with a stunned expression. "Miss Fairfax, there is a gentleman at the door requesting your presence. With a carriage." She lowered her voice to a reverent whisper. "A Vanderbilt carriage." The porridge churned uncomfortably in Charlotte's stomach. She forced herself to walk calmly to the entrance, aware of the gazes that followed her. An impeccably liveried coachman, A navy blue frock coat with gold buttons engraved with the Vanderbilt monogram awaited respectfully on the doorstep. He held an envelope of thick cream paper. "Miss Charlotte Fairfax? Mr. Robert Vanderbilt instructed me to deliver this personally and await your reply." Charlotte accepted the envelope with fingers that betrayed her nervousness. The red wax seal bore the family crest. She carefully broke it and extracted a card with elegant and distinctly masculine handwriting. "Miss Fairfax. I apologize for the abrupt nature of my declaration last night. It was not my intention to cause you discomfort or compromise your reputation, though I acknowledge I likely achieved both. Would you grant me the honor of a private conversation, properly chaperoned naturally, this morning? There are matters that must be discussed before you depart for the countryside. My carriage awaits to transport you to a location of your choosing. Mrs. Pemberton will be notified and may accompany you as your chaperone if she wishes. Respectfully, Robert C. Vanderbilt." Charlotte reread the message 3 times. The language was formal, almost legalistic, but there was an underlying urgency that shone through the carefully chosen words. "Does Mr. Vanderbilt await a reply?" she asked the coachman. "Yes, miss. Mr. Vanderbilt is in Central Park at the pavilion near the lake. He thought a public setting would be more appropriate than any private residence." Sensible. A public meeting would avoid additional scandal while allowing for the necessary conversation. Charlotte bit her lower lip, weighing her options. She could refuse, keep her distance, let this bizarre episode dissolve into eventual gossip. In a few weeks, she would be miles away, educating children in the countryside, and all of this would seem like a fever dream. But the vulnerable hope in those brown eyes continued to haunt her. "Wait a moment," she finally said. "I need to fetch my shawl and inform Mrs. Pemberton." 20 minutes later, Charlotte found herself once again inside a Vanderbilt carriage, this time with Mrs. Pemberton beside her, radiating calculated approval. The city was waking up around them, street vendors opening their stalls, factory workers heading to their factories, society ladies beginning their morning shopping rounds. Central Park stretched out like a green oasis in the heart of Manhattan. The carriage stopped near the artificial lake, where a few rowboats already glided over the calm water. Charlotte spotted Robert immediately. He was alone, having dismissed the usual servants, dressed more casually than the previous evening, tweed trousers and an alpaca coat without the formal waistcoat. He looked younger this way, less the intimidating air, and more simply a man. When their eyes met, Charlotte felt that inexplicable tremor again. Destiny, perhaps, or just shared madness. Robert approached, removing his hat in deference. "Miss Fairfax, I thank you immensely for coming." He gestured to a nearby bench, strategically positioned where Mrs. Pemberton could observe them from a respectable distance. "We have much to discuss." Charlotte settled onto the wrought iron bench, her hands clasped in her lap in an attempt to control the tremor that threatened to betray her. Robert sat respectfully at an appropriate distance, though Charlotte perceived that every inch between them seemed to vibrate with an invisible tension. Mrs. Pemberton had positioned herself strategically about 10 meters away, feigning interest in the spring flowers while maintaining discreet vigilance. "I must begin with an apology," Robert began, turning his hat between his hands in a surprisingly nervous gesture for someone of his standing. "My behavior last night was precipitate, impulsive, completely inappropriate for the circumstances." Charlotte forced herself to meet his eyes. In the morning light, she could see details that the candlelight had hidden the previous night. Small lines around his eyes suggested sleepless nights. There was a tension in his jaw that spoke of habitual restraint, as if he spent most of his time keeping emotions carefully controlled. "You needn't apologize for what was essentially my fault," she replied, keeping her voice low but firm. "It was I who stained your attire and caused the initial embarrassment. Miss Fairfax, please." He leaned slightly towards her, then seemed to realize the impropriety and drew back. "Nothing that happened subsequently was your responsibility. I need you to understand my position." He paused, studying the calm waters of the lake, as if searching for the right words within them. "Since I returned from Harvard 5 years ago, my life has followed a script written by others. My mother orchestrates every dinner, every social event, every encounter with suitable young ladies. My father expects me to gradually take over the management of the railway businesses, following every decision he makes as if I were merely an extension of his will." Charlotte remained silent, sensing that he needed to say things he had probably never expressed aloud. "There are expectations," Robert continued, a subtle bitterness coloring his words. "I must marry before 30, to a suitable heiress. I must produce children who will perpetuate the Vanderbilt name. I must attend the same tedious events, converse with the same empty people, feign interest in discussions of family lineages and corporate mergers." He finally returned his gaze to Charlotte, and there was a raw vulnerability there that disarmed her completely. "And then you spilled wine on me." She blinked, confused. "I don't understand how that—" "It was real." The intensity in his voice made Charlotte shiver. "Your mortification, your panic, your stumbling apologies, nothing rehearsed, nothing calculated, just a genuine human reaction to an embarrassing accident. And when I looked at your face, I saw something I haven't found in years in those drawing rooms." He hesitated, then pronounced the words like a confession. "Honesty, vulnerability, truth." Charlotte felt her heart quicken dangerously. "Mr. Vanderbilt—" "Robert," he interrupted softly, "when we are alone, appropriately chaperoned, naturally, I would prefer you call me Robert." "Robert," she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. It felt simultaneously improper and surprisingly natural. "I must be frank. I do not understand your intentions. A courtship between us is absurd. Your mother made that perfectly clear." "My mother," Robert pronounced with a mixture of exasperated affection and frustration, "believes the world operates according to immutable rules established by people who confuse antiquity with wisdom. She is not incorrect in many respects. The difference in social standing between us is significant. A marriage would be complicated, likely scandalous, possibly disastrous for both families." Charlotte felt her heart sink. So he had reached the same sensible conclusion she had arrived at during her sleepless night. "But," he continued, and the word hung between them like a promise, "I am not proposing immediate marriage. I am proposing the possibility of getting to know one another, genuinely, without the masks that society demands we wear." He extended his hand, stopping centimeters from hers, not touching but offering. "You will depart for the countryside in 4 days. Allow me these 4 days. Public encounters, always chaperoned, completely respectable. Just honest conversations between two people trying to understand if there is something real here beyond an impulsive moment." Charlotte looked at the hand suspended between them. It was an impossible offer. 4 days would not change the reality of their positions. In less than a week she would be miles away, educating children, and Robert would return to his world of railway businesses and elaborate dinners. But there was something in the vulnerable hope in his eyes that made her hesitate. She thought of her mother, who had left a comfortable position as a Duchess's lady's companion to marry a poor clergyman because, as she had told Charlotte years later, "Some choices are made not with the head, but with the part of us that recognizes truths that reason cannot comprehend." 4 days, Charlotte heard herself say, her own voice sounding distant, "but with conditions." Robert arched an eyebrow, surprise and something akin to admiration crossing his features. "I am listening. First, nothing that compromises my reputation beyond what has already been compromised. Public encounters with a chaperone always present. Second, if at the end of these 4 days either of us concludes that this is impossible, we will end it without recriminations, and I will depart from my position with the Ashworths. Third." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "During these 4 days we must both be completely honest. No performances, no pretenses. If it is reality you seek, then we must both offer it, even when it is uncomfortable." "Especially when it is uncomfortable," Robert agreed, a slow smile illuminating his features. This time, he completed the gesture, taking Charlotte's hand in his. Even through her gloves she felt the warmth. "I accept your conditions, all of them." Mrs. Pemberton coughed delicately, a subtle reminder that the touch was lingering beyond what was appropriate. Robert released Charlotte's hand with visible reluctance. "Then we begin today," he declared, rising and formally offering his arm. "Allow me to show you the park. It is one of the few places in New York where I can breathe without feeling the walls of expectation closing in around me." Charlotte accepted his arm, aware that Mrs. Pemberton followed them at a respectable distance. They walked slowly along the path circling the lake, observing the first morning families feeding ducks and children running with wooden hoops. "Tell me about Hampshire," Robert requested. "You mentioned yesterday that you are from England." Charlotte hesitated, then remembered the third condition: honesty. "My father was a vicar in a small parish. We didn't own much, but there was contentment. Books, gardens, meaningful conversations." She felt the familiar pang of loss. "My mother passed away when I was 19. My father followed her 6 months later. Some say it was his heart, but I believe it was simply an inability to continue without her." "I am sorry," Robert said softly, and there was genuine empathy in his voice. To lose both so closely must have been devastating. It was. Charlotte was surprised by the ease of the confession. "The parish passed to a new vicar. I had no family, no resources. A distant cousin of my mother's suggested I seek a position as a governess in London. The journey across the Atlantic was terrifying. 3 weeks in third class, seasick, frightened, surrounded by people who did not speak my language." She looked at him. "I am no romantic heroine, Robert. I am merely a woman trying to survive with dignity in circumstances I did not choose. And that," he replied, stopping to face her directly, "is infinitely more admirable than any romantic novel heroine. You possess real courage, strength born of necessity, not privilege." They resumed their walk, and Charlotte realized something had changed. The initial tension had dissipated, replaced by a surprising ease. Robert began to tell her about Harvard, about feeling perpetually out of place among peers who viewed education as a social obligation rather than a genuine opportunity for learning. "I wanted to study architecture," he confessed, pointing to an elegant bridge spanning a narrow segment of the lake, "to create beautiful and functional things, but it was not appropriate for a Vanderbilt. Railroads, finance, commercial ventures, those were the acceptable areas." "And you simply accepted it?" Charlotte asked, genuinely curious. "I accepted it because—" He paused, clearly struggling with the answer. "Because it is easier to follow the established path than to forge a new one. Because disappointing my family seemed intolerable. Because I convinced myself that obligation and purpose were synonymous." He looked at her with a sad smile. "Until someone spilled wine on me and made me realize that perhaps I was living someone else's life." Charlotte felt a tightening in her chest. There was danger here, she recognized. Not physical danger or the danger of scandal, but something deeper. The danger of two lonely people finding solace in each other, building castles of hope upon impossible foundations. "Robert," she said softly, 4 days do not change realities. In a week, I will be educating children in the countryside. You will be here, managing railroads and attending dinners. What are we doing but prolonging the inevitable?" He stopped again, turning to face her completely. The morning had advanced, and the sun filtered through the newly bloomed trees, creating patterns of light and shadow across his features. "Perhaps," he admitted, "or perhaps 4 days of honesty are worth more than a lifetime of comfortable pretense. Perhaps we don't know what is possible until we try." His voice lowered, becoming almost intimate despite Mrs. Pemberton's proximity. "Are you not curious, Charlotte, about what this could be?" And there, with the sun warming her shoulders and the sounds of the park around them, Charlotte recognized the truth she had been avoiding since the scandalous kiss. Yes, she was curious. Terribly, dangerously curious. 4 days, she repeated, as if establishing a pact. "After that, reality returns." "After that," Robert agreed, "we will face reality, together or apart, but without regrets." He offered his arm again, and Charlotte accepted, both aware that they had just crossed a threshold from which there was no simple return. The New York Public Library exuded the characteristic aroma of aged paper and beeswax. Charlotte walked down the narrow aisles between floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, her fingers lightly tracing the leather spines as Robert walked beside her. maintaining the respectable distance that Mrs. Pemberton's presence, strategically positioned near the entrance, required. It was the second day of their impossible agreement, and Charlotte had discovered something surprising. Talking with Robert Vanderbilt was unsettlingly easy. There was none of the performative affectation she had observed in other gentlemen of high society, no attempt to impress her with superficial knowledge or exaggerated achievements. "My sister Penelope believes that excessive reading makes women unsuitable for marriage," Robert commented, taking a volume of Byron's poetry from the shelf. "She herself reads nothing but fashion magazines and social correspondence." "And do you agree with that assessment?" Charlotte asked, accepting the book he offered. "Absolutely not. I consider uncultivated minds to make anyone unsuitable for meaningful conversation, regardless of gender." He hesitated, then added with raw honesty, "Though I admit I was raised to expect my future wife to be ornamental rather than intellectual." Charlotte leafed through the pages of Byron, considering his words. "And now? Have your expectations changed?" Robert leaned against the bookshelf, studying her with that disconcerting intensity she was beginning to recognize. Let's just say the spilled wine offered a different perspective on what constitutes true value in a companion. "Then I should thank my lack of coordination," Charlotte replied lightly, though she felt the weight of the conversation. "It provided you with a convenient epiphany." "Not convenient, necessary." He picked up another book, pretending to examine its cover as he continued. "There's a young lady my mother particularly favors, Caroline Astor, granddaughter of the family patriarch. Beautiful, perfectly educated, with a considerable fortune. We could unite two of New York's most influential families." Charlotte felt an unpleasant pang that she recognized with discomfort as jealousy. "That sounds like an ideal arrangement." "It does, doesn't it?" Robert returned the book to the shelf with more force than necessary. "Except that in 6 months of courtship, orchestrated by our respective mothers, Caroline and I have never had a single genuine conversation. We've discussed the weather, operas neither of us truly appreciates, and the advantages of various European honeymoon destinations. Does she have a real opinion on matters that count? I have no idea. Does she know my true thoughts on any subject? Absolutely not." Charlotte moved to the next bookshelf, dedicated to philosophical works. "Perhaps you haven't given her an adequate opportunity. Women are taught to conceal their true opinions in front of suitors." "Exactly." Robert followed her, maintaining an appropriate distance but lowering his voice. "It is precisely this system that exhausts me. This elaborate theater, where everyone pretends to be domesticated versions of themselves. How does one build a life based on performances?" "Many people build precisely that," Charlotte replied, turning to face him. "Successful marriages based on mutual convenience and polite respect." "Successful by what measure? The production of heirs? The maintenance of social appearances?" There was growing frustration in his voice. "My parents have a perfectly adequate marriage by all external standards. My father manages business, my mother manages the household and social standing. They rarely converse beyond practical matters. They've slept in separate rooms for years. It's a civilized, orderly, completely empty existence." Charlotte absorbed this revelation, suddenly understanding much about the man before her. "And you fear replicating that pattern?" "I fear waking up at 50, realizing I've spent half my life in continuous performance, married to a polite stranger who shares my surname but not my thoughts, my fears, my hopes." He ran a hand through his hair, dislodging it from its careful arrangement. "It's a terrifying future, Charlotte." The use of her first name, even in a low voice, sent a shiver down Charlotte's spine. They had crossed some invisible line of formality in the past 2 days, approaching an intimacy that defied their impossible circumstances. "And you believe," and she said softly, "that 4 days of honest conversations with me will offer a viable alternative to that fate." Robert took half a step closer, testing the limits of propriety. "I believe you've already offered me something no woman of my class ever has. The truth. About your situation, your fears, your losses. Not calculated performances to impress, but raw reality." "Perhaps because I have nothing to gain by pretending," Charlotte countered, though his observation touched her more deeply than she cared to admit. "My position is clear. I am a governess without fortune or connections. I cannot compete with Caroline Astor or any other heiress your mother might prefer. Therefore, there's no reason for pretense. And what if I were to say, Robert pronounced each word carefully, that precisely this impossibility is what makes this real, that for the first time I'm meeting someone who has no ulterior agenda, no interest in my fortune or position. Charlotte felt something clench in her chest. That would be convenient for you, but dangerous for me. Explain. She took a deep breath, committing to the honesty they had agreed upon. You can explore this. Attraction, curiosity, whatever it is, without real consequences. When I leave in 2 days, you will return to your privileged life. Perhaps you'll marry Caroline Astor, perhaps another suitable young woman. Eventually, this will just be an interesting anecdote from your youth. Her voice trembled slightly. For me, the consequences are potentially devastating. If you allow me to believe there's a real possibility here, if I open my heart only to face inevitable separation, you'll get hurt, Robert finished, understanding crossing his features. And you've already suffered enough losses. Exactly. Charlotte moved away, putting a safe distance between them. Therefore, while I appreciate our conversations, I must maintain a realistic perspective. This is an interlude, not a prologue to anything lasting. Silence descended between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Charlotte pretended to examine a volume on Greek philosophy, though the words blurred before her eyes. And what if I don't accept that limitation? Robert's voice came from behind her, controlled but laden with emotion. What if I told you that in these 2 days, I've discovered something I've been searching for years without knowing? That when I wake in the morning, my first thought is our next meeting? That for the first time, I imagine a future that doesn't feel like a gilded cage? Charlotte turned slowly, meeting his eyes. What she saw there disarmed her. Absolute vulnerability, fearful hope. A desire to believe in possibilities that reason denied. Robert, she whispered, aware that Mrs. Pemberton might be observing, you are confusing novelty with substance. I represent an escape from your restrictive world, but that doesn't mean we are suited for each other beyond this temporary bubble. Perhaps, he didn't look away, or perhaps you are so accustomed to loss that you protect yourself in advance, denying possibilities before they can disappoint you. The observation hit a raw nerve. Charlotte felt an old wound throb. And what if you're right? What if this is just a fantasy we're cultivating to avoid our respective realities? Then we'll find out in 2 days, Robert replied. But Charlotte, I ask you to at least consider, what if it isn't a fantasy? What if it's the beginning of something we could build despite the obstacles? Before Charlotte could reply, Mrs. Pemberton approached, her presence reminding them of propriety. Miss Fairfax, we should return to the boarding house. You have correspondence from the Ashworth family waiting. Charlotte nodded, grateful for the interruption and simultaneously frustrated by it. Robert offered his arm formally, leading her towards the exit. The carriage awaited, and during the ride back, they maintained a superficial conversation about the architecture of the passing buildings, both avoiding the deeper topics. When they arrived at the boarding house, Robert alighted first, assisting Charlotte with a steady hand. For a brief moment their eyes met, silent communication passing between them. Tomorrow? He asked simply. Charlotte knew she should refuse, establish sensible boundaries, protect herself from the inevitable, but when she opened her mouth she heard herself say tomorrow. Inside the narrow room, Charlotte opened the correspondence from the Ashworths. It was a cordial letter confirming her expected arrival in 3 days, detailing the 3 children she would educate, describing the rural property where she would work. It was a concrete, secure, appropriate future. She held the letter, then looked out the window at the street where the Vanderbilt carriage had disappeared. 2 futures presented themselves, one guaranteed and modest, the other impossible and tempting. Charlotte didn't know which she would choose, but she recognized with growing and terrifying clarity that her heart had already begun to decide, regardless of what her reason advised. And that, she realized with a mixture of dread and excitement, would change absolutely everything. The 3rd day dawned with a cloudy sky that threatened rain. Charlotte waited by her bedroom window, watching the street when the Vanderbilt carriage appeared punctually at 10 o'clock. This time, Robert alighted personally to accompany her, his expression revealing something she couldn't quite decipher, determination mixed with apprehension. "Today," he announced as he helped Charlotte and Mrs. Pemberton into the carriage, "I would like to take you to a place few people know, a private family retreat." Mrs. Pemberton arched an eyebrow in silent warning, but did not protest. The carriage traversed Manhattan northwards, leaving behind the bustling streets until it reached a smaller property on the outskirts of the city. It was not as imposing as the main Vanderbilt mansion, but it possessed a discreet elegance that Charlotte found more appealing. "My grandfather built this house when he first arrived in America," Robert explained as he guided Charlotte through well-tended gardens. "Before the fortune, before the railroads, he was just a Dutch immigrant with ambition and determination. This property represents his roots, something my father prefers to forget in favor of grander symbols of success." Charlotte lightly touched the roses that were beginning to bloom along the path. "And you? Do you prefer this to the mansion?" "Always." There was a quiet conviction in his voice. "Here I can breathe without feeling the weight of centuries of expectations. It's just a place, without an elaborate history to uphold, without impossible standards to maintain." They entered a library smaller than a public one, but infinitely more welcoming. Wide windows allowed natural light, and the shelves contained volumes clearly read and loved, not just displayed. Mrs. Pemberton strategically settled near the door, taking embroidery from her bag. Robert led Charlotte to a window overlooking the gardens. "I need to be completely honest about something. Last night I had a difficult conversation with my mother." Charlotte felt her stomach clench. "About us? About expectations, obligations, and the future she meticulously plans for me." He turned to face her directly. "Caroline Astor and her family will dine with us in 5 days. My mother intends to formally announce our engagement on that occasion." The words hit Charlotte like ice water. She knew this was inevitable, but hearing the concrete confirmation made everything terribly real. "I understand. So our agreement ends not tomorrow but today. There's no reason to prolong something that—" "I refused." The words came out abruptly, interrupting her. Charlotte blinked, uncertain if she had heard correctly. "What?" "I told my mother I will not marry Caroline Astor, that I will not participate in an orchestrated theater that culminates in a union without love or true understanding." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Charlotte had begun to recognize as an indicator of stress. It was not well received. "I imagine not." Charlotte sat on a nearby chair, her legs suddenly weak. "Robert, you can't simply undo years of planning because of 4 days of—" "Of what, Charlotte? Say it." He knelt before her, a highly improper position that made Mrs. Pemberton cough in alarm. Robert ignored her. 4 days of what?" "Of illusion," Charlotte whispered, though the words were hard to utter. "Of escape from reality. Robert, I leave tomorrow. Nothing has changed that. Everything has changed that." There was a raw urgency in his voice. "Charlotte, I've spent 5 years living a version of life that other people wrote for me. Every decision filtered through what was appropriate, expected, advantageous for the family. And then you appear completely unsuitable by all the standards I was taught to value, and in 3 days you showed me what it feels like to live honestly." Charlotte felt tears threaten, but forced them back. "And what do you propose? That I cancel my position with the Ashworths? That I remain in New York, waiting while you confront your family? Robert, I don't have the resources for that. I need this position." "I know." He took her hands, holding them firmly. "And I'm not asking you to sacrifice your security for vague promises. I'm asking for time. Go to the Ashworths as planned. Settle in, work, maintain your independence. But allow me to court you properly. Correspondence, occasional visits if the family permits, a gradual building of something real. Your mother will never accept it." "My mother," Robert pronounced with a firmness Charlotte hadn't heard before, "does not control my heart. She can control my inheritance, my social standing, even my access to family businesses. But this—" He pressed Charlotte's hand to his chest, where she could feel his heart racing. "This is mine." Charlotte closed her eyes, fighting against a dangerous hope that blossomed. "You're asking me to believe in a fairy tale, that class differences don't matter, that love conquers obstacles, that happy endings happen for orphan governesses. I'm asking you to believe in me." His voice dropped to an intense whisper. In us. In what we've discovered these past few days. I don't promise ease, Charlotte. There will be resistance from my family, social scandal, unimaginable complications, but I promise honesty, genuine effort, real commitment. And what if it's not enough? What if after months you realize that Caroline Astor or another suitable young woman offers a simpler life? What if your family makes it impossible for you to proceed? Robert released her hands, standing and walking to the window. Silence stretched between them, heavy with possibilities and fears. Charlotte watched his tense back, the way his shoulders curved under an invisible weight. My grandfather, he began finally, still looking out at the gardens, risked everything coming to America. He left family, security, everything he knew, pursuing something he could barely articulate. When asked why, he would simply say that some choices are made not with logic, but with a part of us that recognizes truths that reason denies. He turned, meeting Charlotte's eyes. I've known you for only 3 days. Logically, that's insufficient for decisions that will affect my entire life. But this part of me, he touched his chest again, it recognizes something in you that I've searched for without knowing, and I cannot simply ignore it because it is inconvenient or complicated. Charlotte rose, approaching him with slow steps. I am so afraid, she confessed, her voice breaking slightly. I've already lost everyone I loved. My mother, my father, the life I knew. I built careful walls around what remains, promising never again to expose myself to that kind of pain. And I am asking you to tear down those walls. Robert extended his hand, not touching, just offering. I know what I'm asking, Charlotte. I know the risk. She looked at the hand suspended between them, a symbol of an impossible choice. Security versus possibility. Protection versus vulnerability. A guaranteed but limited future versus an uncertain but potentially extraordinary one. If we do this, she said slowly, still without touching his hand, we need clear rules. I will go to the Ashworths tomorrow. I will settle in, fulfill my contract for at least 6 months. During that time, you will resolve matters with your family, clarify your position. Correspondence will be our only communication, unless circumstances permit appropriate visits. I agree. And if after 6 months either of us concludes that this is not viable, we will end it with dignity, without blame, without recriminations. I agree, he repeated, though something in his eyes suggested he would not accept such a conclusion easily. Charlotte took a deep breath, then placed her hand in his. The contact sent warmth through her arm, settling deep in her chest. Then we try. Against all logic and good sense, we try. Robert intertwined their fingers, a firm and comforting clasp. Against all logic and good sense, he agreed, a slow smile illuminating his features. Mrs. Pemberton coughed again, more insistently. They separated, aware that they had overstepped the bounds of propriety. But something fundamental had changed. Charlotte felt it in the air between them, in the way Robert looked at her, in the new certainty that had replaced the confusion of the past few days. Tomorrow will be difficult, Robert said softly. Goodbyes always are. Then let's not make them dramatic, Charlotte suggested, forcing practicality. Just until we meet again. Until we meet again, he repeated, turning the words into a promise. They remained for another hour in the library, conversing about lighter subjects, favorite books, childhood memories, small joys that make life bearable. There was a different intimacy now, not based on romantic intensity, but on the conscious building of a foundation for something lasting. When they finally returned to the boarding house, Charlotte felt a contradictory mixture of peace and anxiety. She had made a choice that defied all prudence, staking her heart against overwhelming odds. But for the first time since losing her parents, she felt truly alive, not just surviving, but actively choosing her destiny. That night, preparing her few possessions for the morning journey, Charlotte allowed herself to consider impossible possibilities. Perhaps, just perhaps, fairy tales happened for orphan governesses who spilled wine on Vanderbilt heirs. And if they didn't, at least she would have tried. At least she would have chosen courage over fear, hope over resignation. It was all she could ask for. And, for now, it was enough. The Ashworth's carriage awaited at the railway station, a modest conveyance compared to the ornate vehicles of the Vanderbilts. Charlotte watched her small trunk being loaded, aware that every mile would take her further from New York and from Robert. The train journey had been long, traversing landscapes that gradually transformed urbanization into verdant fields and scattered villages. Mrs. Ashworth was a robust woman in her early 40s, with a maternal face and eyes that assessed Charlotte with cautious approval. Her husband, a silent man with calloused hands from working his own land, merely nodded briefly before taking the reins. "The children are eager to meet you," Mrs. Ashworth commented, as the carriage followed a dirt road lined with ancient oaks. "Especially Eleanor. She's 9 years old and devours books with an appetite that worries my husband. He fears that excessive reading will compromise her matrimonial prospects." Charlotte forced a smile, remembering Robert's similar observation about his sister. "I believe that education only broadens perspectives, never limits them." "A refreshing view," the lady replied, satisfaction evident in her voice. "Mrs. Pemberton assured me that you possess sound principles despite, well, we've heard rumors about a certain incident at the Vanderbilt mansion." Charlotte's heart pounded. Less than 5 days and the scandal had already reached the countryside. "It was an unfortunate accident involving spilled wine," she said carefully. "Magnified by excessive gossip, I'm sure." Mrs. Ashworth studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Gossip travels faster than truth, especially when it involves prominent families. As long as your work here isn't affected by external distractions, we have no concerns." The Ashworth property proved surprisingly charming. It didn't possess the grandeur of the New York mansions, but there was an honest beauty in its simplicity. The main house was a solid stone construction with a slate roof surrounded by practical gardens where vegetables grew alongside flowers. An orchard stretched to the east, apple trees laden with young fruit swaying in the gentle breeze. 3 children awaited on the porch, their postures varying from eager curiosity to studied indifference. Eleanor was easily identifiable, brown hair in neat braids, grey eyes shining with sharp intelligence, hands clutching a book as if it were a lifeline. Beside her, the elder brother, William, observed with the typical skepticism of a 12-year-old boy who considered formal education unnecessary. The youngest, little Margaret, aged 6, hid partially behind her sister. "Children, this is Miss Fairfax," Mrs. Ashworth announced. "She has come a long way to assist in your education." Eleanor stepped forward immediately, a graceful curtsy demonstrating prior education. "Is it true that you know the Greek alphabet, miss? The previous governess insisted it wasn't appropriate for girls." Charlotte felt instant affection for the child. "Completely true, Eleanor, and there's nothing inappropriate about expanding knowledge beyond arbitrary limitations." Eleanor's eyes lit up like kindled candles. William remained less impressed, crossing his arms defensively. "My father says that Latin and advanced mathematics are wasted on those who will work the land. Your father," Charlotte replied carefully, "is a practical man. But knowledge is never wasted, William. Even agriculture benefits from mathematics to calculate yields and crop rotation." The boy seemed to consider this, his skepticism marginally decreasing. Margaret remained silent, watching Charlotte with the huge eyes of a startled fawn. Mrs. Ashworth led Charlotte to her quarters on the 2nd floor. The room was simple but comfortable, significantly superior to the accommodations at the boarding house. A bed with a muslin canopy, an oak dresser, a desk strategically positioned near the window that offered a view of the orchards. There was even a small bookshelf, empty, waiting to be filled. "Dinner will be served at 6 o'clock, the lady informed her. "You will dine with us, naturally. We do not maintain excessive distinctions between family and staff in our home. Lessons will begin tomorrow morning, after breakfast. Eleanor often wakes early, so don't be surprised if you find her in the library before dawn." When she was finally alone, Charlotte sat on the edge of the bed, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability. The reality of her decision settled heavily. She was here, miles from New York, committed to responsibilities that would demand her full attention. And Robert. Robert was there, confronting family, social scandal, centuries of expectations. She took from her bag the only personal item besides clothes, a small miniature portrait of her parents, painted years earlier when they still possessed modest means. Their faces gazed at her with serene expressions, frozen in a moment of happiness that had preceded the devastating losses. "I made an impossible choice," she whispered to the silent images. "I allowed myself to believe in possibilities that defy all good sense. Would they say I'm foolish or brave?" The painted faces offered no reply, but Charlotte imagined that her mother, who had risked so much for love, would perhaps understand. The first few days established a comforting routine. Charlotte awoke at dawn, invariably finding Eleanor already settled in the small library, reading by lamplight. Mornings were dedicated to formal studies: Latin for Eleanor and William, basic reading for Margaret, mathematics for all. Afternoons allowed for more practical activities: exploratory walks, identifying local flora, simple scientific experiments using household materials, history lessons contextualized through literature. William gradually disarmed, especially when Charlotte demonstrated practical knowledge about agriculture that he respected. Margaret flourished under gentle attention, revealing sharp intelligence hidden beneath initial shyness. Eleanor became a constant companion, hungry for knowledge that Charlotte dispensed generously. But at night, alone in her room, Charlotte faced silences that amplified anxieties. No correspondence had arrived from Robert. She didn't expect immediate communication. Establishing reliable mail service between New York and an isolated rural property would take time. Still, each day without news increased corrosive doubts. Perhaps he would reconsider after facing his mother's fury. Perhaps the physical distance offered perspective, revealing his declaration as an unsustainable romantic impulse. Perhaps Caroline Astor, with her beauty and fortune, seemed a more sensible option under the cold light of reality. On the 10th night, Charlotte allowed herself to cry, silent tears that dampened her pillow as she confronted the possibility that she had staked her heart and lost. It would be survivable, she assured herself. She had survived greater losses, but she recognized with painful clarity that losing Robert would hurt differently, not the loss of something possessed, but of a possibility that had never fully materialized. The 11th morning brought a change. Mrs. Ashworth intercepted Charlotte after breakfast, an elegant envelope in hand. The paper was thick, expensive, a wax seal bearing a family monogram. "It arrived by express mail this morning," the lady said, thinly disguised curiosity in her voice. "Correspondence from New York." Charlotte accepted the envelope with hands that trembled imperceptibly. She recognized the handwriting immediately, firm, elegant, distinctly masculine. She murmured her thanks and retreated to the garden, seeking privacy before breaking the seal. "My dearest Charlotte, forgive the delay in writing. The past few days have been tumultuous would be an inadequately mild term. My mother reacted with predictable fury to my refusal of the arrangement with Caroline. There were confrontations I prefer not to detail, threats involving inheritance and social standing, attempts to make me reconsider through coordinated family pressure. I remained firm, not out of obstinacy, but because the alternative, to return to that porcelain existence you witnessed, became intolerable after meeting you. My father, surprisingly, proved more understanding than my mother. He also married for convenience and, in a rare moment of honesty, admitted he wouldn't recommend such a path for his children if alternatives existed. I think of you constantly. I imagine you on a rural estate, educating children fortunate enough to receive your attention. I hope your circumstances are satisfactory, that the family treats you with the respect you deserve. I hope above all that you are not doubting my sincerity. Because, Charlotte, every word I uttered remains true. Every promise made stands firm. I am resolving matters here, establishing an independence that will allow me to choose my own future, not a version prescribed by family expectations. It will take time. It will demand patience that I know is difficult when separated by distance. But I ask you to keep faith in me, in us, in the possibilities we identified in those impossible days. I will write regularly, documenting my journey just as I hope you will document yours. and when circumstances allow, I will visit properly with the Ashworths' approval. Until then, I carry the memory of your face, your honesty, your courage. They are gifts that sustain me through family storms. Eternally yours, Robert. Charlotte read the letter 3 times, then 4, memorizing every word. Relief flooded her so intensely that she felt her knees weaken. She sat on a garden bench, pressing the paper against her chest, as if she could absorb the words directly into her heart. He had not reconsidered. He had not chosen ease over complication. He remained committed, facing consequences that Charlotte could only imagine. But with relief came a renewed weight of responsibility. Robert risked so much: family, inheritance, social standing. And why? For a governess who had spilled wine, for 4 days of honest conversations, for the intangible possibility of genuine happiness. It was simultaneously terrifying and profoundly moving. Charlotte remained in the garden for an extended period, watching bees work among the flowers, birds building nests in nearby trees, natural cycles of life continuing indifferent to human dramas. There was a lesson there, she recognized. Nature didn't question what seemed impossible. Seeds grew in improbable soil. Trees bloomed despite storms. Life found ways. Perhaps her relationship with Robert followed a similar logic. Improbable, defying conventional expectations, yet persisting through mutual commitment and stubborn hope. When she returned home, she found Eleanor waiting anxiously. "Miss Fairfax, my mother acquired a new book on astronomy. Could we study it this afternoon?" Charlotte smiled, carefully folding the letter and tucking it into her pocket. "Absolutely, Eleanor. Astronomy is fascinating. It teaches us that even distant stars exert influence, that connections exist across vast distances." The girl nodded enthusiastically, not grasping the deeper meaning. But Charlotte felt the truth of the words settle in her heart. Distance was merely physical. Real connections transcended miles, sustained by honest communication and genuine commitment. She and Robert had embarked on an extraordinary journey, impossible by conventional standards, yet real in the way that mattered. And Charlotte, for the first time since leaving New York, allowed herself to believe completely that perhaps, just perhaps, fairy tales did happen for governesses brave enough to risk. The carriage passed through the wrought-iron gate of the Ashworth estate one October afternoon, 6 months after Charlotte's arrival. She watched from the library window as the elegant vehicle emerged down the oak-lined drive, unmistakably Vanderbilt in its impeccable finish and perfectly trained horses. Her heart hammered against her ribs, 6 months of weekly correspondence culminating in this impossible moment. "Miss Fairfax, you have a visitor." Eleanor's voice echoed through the hall, vibrant with ill-contained excitement. The girl had discovered the romance through curious questions and fragments of conversation, becoming an enthusiastic accomplice. Charlotte smoothed the navy wool dress that Mrs. Ashworth had insisted on ordering, arguing that a governess in her household deserved appropriate attire. Her hands trembled slightly as she tucked away rebellious strands escaping her chignon. 6 months. Letters sharing thoughts, fears, small everyday joys. But words on paper differed vastly from physical presence. Robert waited in the drawing room, conversing respectfully with Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth. He wore a traveling suit in discreet shades of grey and brown, none of the ostentation that characterized social appearances in New York. When his eyes met Charlotte's through the partially open door, something passed between them that transcended the months of separation. "Miss Fairfax." He bowed formally, but there was a warmth in his voice that contradicted the formality. "I thank the Ashworths for allowing this visit. I hope it is not an inconvenience." "Absolutely not, Mr. Vanderbilt." Mrs. Ashworth practically radiated approval. Robert's letters had included correspondence to Charlotte's employers, stating honorable intentions and requesting permission for proper courtship. "We shall have tea in the garden at 4 o'clock. Naturally, Eleanor will accompany Miss Fairfax as a chaperone." Eleanor nodded enthusiastically, already positioning herself strategically to observe the unfolding romance she had followed through Charlotte's discreet accounts. The autumn garden presented a melancholic beauty, golden and crimson leaves drifting softly under a cool breeze. Robert offered his arm, a familiar gesture that sent memories cascading back. 6 months vanished, reducing themselves to those 4 impossible days that had changed everything. "Are you well?" His first private words carried genuine concern. "Your letters were always positive, but I feared you might omit difficulties so as not to worry me." Charlotte smiled, touched by his perception. "The circumstances here are genuinely satisfactory. The Ashworths treat me with respect. The children blossom under appropriate guidance, and I have discovered real purpose in the work." She hesitated, then added honestly, "But your absence weighed heavily. Letters sustain connection, but they do not replace presence." "Precisely what I have discovered." Robert guided her to a stone bench, shaded by an ancient oak, Eleanor discreetly settling a respectful distance away, with a book she was clearly not reading. "Charlotte, there are developments I prefer to communicate in person rather than through correspondence." Something in his tone made Charlotte's heart quicken again, a mix of hope and apprehension. "Developments. My mother has finally accepted that I will not marry according to her prescriptions." He spoke the words carefully, as if each had been hard-won. "It was not a sudden conversion or an enthusiastic embrace of my choice. It was a reluctant recognition that losing her son completely would be worse than tolerating an unapproved union." Charlotte absorbed this, understanding the weight behind the simple words. "And Caroline Astor? She married a banking heir in September. My mother attended the wedding, returning with comments about how radiant and perfectly suited Caroline seemed to her husband." A smile touched his lips. "I believe it was an oblique admission that perfect matches on paper do not always translate into genuine happiness. And your father? Your letters mentioned tensions." "My father proved surprisingly pragmatic." Robert leaned slightly towards her, his voice lowering, though Eleanor could no longer clearly hear them. "He built his fortune through calculated risk, recognizing opportunities others dismissed. He views my choice through that lens, not necessarily romantic, but respectable in its audacity." Charlotte felt something tighten in her chest. "Robert, I need you to be absolutely honest. In these 6 months you have faced real consequences, family estrangement, social scandal, complications I only imagined. Do you not regret it?" He turned fully to face her, taking her hand with a firmness that conveyed certainty. "Regret would be the wrong word. There have been difficult moments, painful conversations, choices that required courage I didn't know I possessed. But Charlotte, every letter from you, every shared thought, every small joy or difficulty you documented reinforced my certainty. You are not merely an escape from an unsatisfying existence. You are the future I want to consciously build." Tears threatened, but Charlotte blinked them back. "There is still an abyss between our positions. Society does not easily forget when Vanderbilt heirs defy expectations. True, there will always be those who look at us with disapproval, who consider our union unsuitable." He squeezed her hand gently. "But there is also a growing world of people who value authenticity over pedigree. My grandfather was an immigrant. My father built upon his foundation but never forgot his origins. Perhaps it is time for the Vanderbilts to remember that true worth does not lie in lineage, but in character." Charlotte allowed herself a moment of complete vulnerability. "I am so afraid, Robert, of believing fully only to discover that reality crushes possibilities, of becoming a burden that limits your potential instead of a companion who supports you." "Then we have corresponding fears," he replied softly. "For I fear I am not worthy of your courage, of the strength you demonstrate daily in building your own life, despite devastating losses. I fear my privilege might make me incapable of fully understanding your challenges." They remained in silence for a moment, hands intertwined, sharing vulnerabilities that strengthened rather than weakened them. Eleanor cleared her throat discreetly, signaling that the appropriate time for physical contact had expired. Robert released Charlotte's hand with reluctance. "There is a formal proposal I came to make, not today, not precipitously, but as a plan for the near future." He took a deep breath. "My contract with the Ashworths extends for another 4 months. When you complete that commitment, would you consider returning to New York, not as a governess in someone else's family, but establishing yourself independently while our courtship formally continues?" Charlotte processed the proposal carefully. "Independently how?" There is a growing school for children from working-class families that seeks qualified educators. A respectable position, a fair salary, with included private lodging. My sister Penelope, surprisingly, has become a proponent of the project. She suggested your candidacy, impressed by letters I shared describing your work here. Your sister, the one who seemed so scandalized, Robert smiled. Penelope possesses a depth that social performances conceal. She recently confided that she envies my courage to choose authenticity over convenience. She is considering involvement in philanthropic causes as an alternative to the arranged marriage our mother plans. Charlotte felt hope blossom, accompanied by necessary pragmatism. And then, I return to New York, take the position at the school, and we continue our courtship while you establish greater independence from your family. Exactly, with a clear objective. He paused, the weight of his next statement evident in his features. Charlotte Fairfax, I am not proposing immediate marriage. It would be imprudent when there are still practical matters to resolve. But I am stating an unequivocal intention to eventually ask for your hand in marriage, when circumstances allow for a union that does not compromise your security or my family relationships completely. Charlotte's heart expanded painfully. You are asking me to wait for an uncertain future. I am asking that we build a future together, step by step, conscious choice by conscious choice. His eyes sought hers intensely. I do not promise ease. I promise genuine commitment, real effort, honesty even when it is uncomfortable. Charlotte thought of her parents, of a love that had defied the conventions of their time. She thought of the 6 months of letters, each revealing more about the man Robert was beyond the air the world saw. She thought of the children she educated, of Eleanor especially, and of how she taught that courage meant facing uncertainties instead of avoiding them. Then I accept, she said finally, her voice firm despite turbulent emotions. Not blindly, not naively, but consciously. I will complete my commitment here, then return to New York. I will take the position at the school, establish my own independence, and we will continue building this extraordinary relationship, careful step by careful step. The smile that illuminated Robert's face could have warmed the autumn day. He rose, offering both hands to help her to her feet. Then we have an agreement. And Charlotte, as we wait, as we build foundations for a shared future, know this. You have already changed my life irreversibly. You have not merely shown me an alternative to the existence I feared. You have shown me who I am when stripped of others' expectations. And you, Charlotte replied, finally allowing herself to embrace hope completely, have shown me that surviving is not the same as living, that choosing vulnerability over protection can be an act of supreme courage. Eleanor approached, pretending she had only just noticed they had finished their private conversation. Miss Fairfax, Mamma requests your presence. Tea is served. They walked back to the house, an improbable trio united by a shared belief in possibilities that defied conventions. Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth awaited with evident approval, having clearly developed genuine affection for the governess who had transformed their children's education. During tea, Robert charmed the children with stories of New York, softened for a young audience, but revealing a humor Charlotte had only partially glimpsed in letters. William questioned him about railway engineering, surprisingly well-informed. Eleanor hung on his every word, already composing mental romances. Little Margaret, overcoming initial shyness, presented a drawing she had made specifically for the visitor. When it was time for Robert to depart, the sun was already declining, painting the sky with rosy and golden hues. Charlotte accompanied him to the carriage, Eleanor maintaining an appropriate vigil, but allowing for a relatively private farewell. 4 months, Robert said softly, holding Charlotte's hand a moment longer than strictly necessary. And then a new phase. Not the end of the journey, but the next consciously chosen chapter. 4 months, Charlotte agreed, squeezing his hand before releasing it. Complete what you need to in New York. I will complete my commitment here. And then... She allowed herself to smile, genuinely, without reservations. And then we will continue to defy impossibilities. She watched the carriage disappear down the oak-lined drive, her hand raised in farewell until it was no longer visible. Eleanor approached, slipping her small hand into Charlotte's. "He truly loves you, doesn't he?" The question carried wisdom beyond her 9 years. "I believe so," Charlotte replied, marveling at the simple truth. "And I love him, not despite the complications, but recognizing that real love demands facing complications together." They walked back to the house as stars began to emerge, Charlotte carrying a new certainty. Her story with Robert did not follow a traditional fairy tale script. There was no dramatic rescue or instant transformation of circumstances. It was a careful construction, choice after choice, day after day, founded on mutual honesty and genuine commitment. And perhaps, Charlotte thought as she prepared for another 4 months of meaningful work, that was better than any fairy tale. Because it was real, earned through courage, sustained through effort, valuable precisely because it was not given, but built. The kiss at the Vanderbilt mansion had changed her destiny, but not in the way Charlotte had initially imagined, not through instant elevation or magical transformation, rather through an awakening to possibilities she could choose for herself, paths she could forge herself. And that, she recognized with deep gratitude, was infinitely more valuable than any prescribed fairy tale ending.